All right. I think we've talked enough about Jacob deGrom. Let's move into the teaching moment where we are going to be troubleshooting velocity with the pelvis and trunk rotation. Can you take it away?
Yes. So we started in the last episode. I love giving you tips, coaches, and also for pitchers who can, take a look at their own self on how to when you're looking at a pitcher or someone, how can you look to see is he doing something that's inhibiting his own ability to produce his top velocity. And when someone comes to me and they want to throw harder, I don't think, oh, I've got to add something in to his motion. I always think I've got to remove something or clean something up that he's already doing, especially when you see a guy who should be throwing harder and he's not throwing harder. Or if you start to see, he was throwing harder last month and this week his velocity is going down. So last week we talked about the rear leg, some of the flaws with it. And this time I want to talk about probably one of the most important things in regard to velocity, the true way that velocity is developed in the body as the segments are moving from the ground up is through the rotation of the pelvis and the trunk muscles. And those forces are transmitted then into the shoulder, the elbow, and then finally into the wrist. And the initiation of that sequence that I just described starts with the pelvis. And the pelvis is the rectangular bone that, and I've said this before, if you had a pair of jeans on, it would be pocket to pocket in the front. It's like a rectangular bone. And up into that, the hip joints, the legs insert. So it's sort of a rectangle with two legs. And the legs are separate from it. And the pelvis is the part of the body that once the foot lands, the pelvis starts the rotation. And then the next sequence is, in science, they just call it the upper trunk, but I call it, I go lower trunk, upper trunk. I like to keep it a little separate, where we've got the pelvis, which would take part of your belt line with it, and then right above the belt line up to about your, chest level. And then you've got the third level that actually brings the arm around. That's the sequence. And the most important part of that sequence of action is that you begin it correctly. And because the pelvis, it's just like some of you may be going, what's the pelvis? It's not like a term that unless you do body work or unless you're a chiropractor or we're in the medical field, you don't talk about that. But it is a critical piece of the rotational sequence where energy is actually transferred, ending up into the hand. So velocity is produced by these segments moving, and each segment has to move to its peak velocity before the next one can move at its peak velocity. So if you don't have correct pelvic movement, you are going to not have correct rotation. So before we go any further, everyone knows I now have a YouTube channel. So when you get to your devices or you're on your phone right now, take a look at the video that is up for this segment. And Joe, have you got it up so that you can be looking at it as well?
I sure do. I'm looking at it right now.
Okie dokie. So I asked one of my guinea pig pitchers, my poor pitchers, they are exposed to the craziest things to help me teach. But anyway, so I have a very simple thing. I asked one of my pitchers to just lay down, and he's got as you can see, his feet together because I wanted to demonstrate what pure pelvic rotation looks like. Now, it's not pure in the sense that we don't see some waistline muscles moving. But what you're going to notice is, so imagine he had jeans on and you see two pockets and they are moving back and forth. He is a right-handed pitcher. So obviously when he rotates his pelvic to the left, you can actually see that he does that better than when he rotates to the right. So just to bring your eyes into focus on the pitching motion, the pitcher steps out and he lands. And when he lands, his pelvis, if he's got really good range of motion, would be flat to the ground. the way this picture is, if you stop the video when he's actually on the ground before he rotates. So you can stop the video when he's flat. That's the way you would want the pelvis to look, or close to that, when the pitcher lands. And then when he lands, then as a right-handed pitcher, the right side of his pelvis will start to rotate just like it's doing. You can turn the video on again, just like it's doing in this video. It rotates around the left hip joint. Then the next piece that happens is the trunk. And the next piece that happens is the upper body. The most important thing is that this pelvic rotation begin. Now, the way this ties in with what we talked about last week, this is why I wanted to bring this into the series on troubleshooting velocity, is that we talked about the importance of getting to the front leg. We've talked many times about where the front leg lands. So as you see this pelvis rotate, notice it's rotating very easily because he's in alignment. If a right-handed pitcher starts to step too far to his right, so he's crossing over his body, and it's what you coaches call throwing across the body. I never understood that term because he's stepping across his body. So if he steps across his body when he starts this rotation, when the right side of the pelvis starts to do what you see it doing in this video, he will not be able to completely rotate the pelvis. And then the trunk and the arm will get ahead of the pelvis. And then you'll have a pitcher who is using incomplete rotation. Usually he's going to lead with the elbow. It affects the way the ball is released. So what has to happen is the pelvis has to begin the movement, just like you're seeing in the video. Then it continues onward to come completely facing the target as the trunk is also rotating and as the arm is coming into position. And then, of course, we're at that what we call max external rotation position. The pitcher is completely squared up to the target. Now, none of this can happen if the pelvis doesn't initiate and if it doesn't continue going, so the trunk comes next and the arm comes last. The worst thing that could happen is that the arm segment gets ahead. So what you want to do, coaches, is you want to look at this pelvic motion. You want to teach pitchers this motion. And then when their stride lands, you should see this motion happening. And just like when you see this pitcher, when he's moving, you can see how it starts to stretch through his trunk. That is exactly the way the trunk is pulling, and you see his arm is staying down on the ground. You're going to get an excessive visual of that full motion there. So now this is a way, and the most important thing is when you see his arm come around, it should be behind the pelvis. Just like when he's doing the little drill here, you see that his arm is staying behind. That's exactly how it is in pitching. And that's how you get the right pre-stretch. But if you're standing on that angle where you can see, if his arm is ahead of his pelvis, in other words, his pelvis hasn't squared up before the arm arrives, and you'll actually see it where it's excessive, where there will be arm ready to deliver and the pelvis hasn't rotated. Then he either didn't know how to rotate his pelvis, or he's stepping in the wrong place, so it's blocking his rotation, or from the errors I talked about last week, he's doing one of those things which didn't allow him to actually even get his body weight into his pelvis so that he could actually turn. So this is the most important thing about rotation. Now, Joe, does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it doesn't look like a whole lot of movement. It just looks like something that's more of a technique thing than anything else.
Yes. So let me say one more thing about the pelvic rotation. So you'll notice on this that he can't really get any further into rotation. And the reason is, this is why I had him do it this way, is because I'm not letting him use his legs. So what the pitcher really does is the pelvis starts the rotation, but the back foot being on the ground is pushing into the ground. And now you've got the hamstrings and some hip rotators that are actually helping the pelvis rotate in the direction in which the pitcher's pitching. So right in front of the pelvis, on the, like if you like in this picture here, right above where the pocket would be on the right side, there's some muscles that are help moving that pelvis into rotation. But if he wanted to go further, he'd have to be using his leg. So you'd have to see a different position. That's why the pitcher can get that pelvis all the way around. But if you don't understand pure pelvic rotation all by itself, you're not going to be able to teach it with the leg. So this is a great way to have them do this. So does that make even more sense, Joe?
Yes, makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Okay. So I am so passionate about rotation. I think most of you know that when I was in graduate school, my graduate project was on the lower body and rotation. And, you know, there have been scientists that have actually studied this, and we know that about 50+% of the velocity is created by these movements here. And there's scientists that have studied this by sitting a pitcher in a chair and not letting him use his lower body and figuring out what segments contributed what. I was so intrigued by rotation because nobody talks about it that I wrote an entire book on it. And I'm so fascinated, even with my own book that I wrote. It was one of the first products that I ever developed. And it's because I felt like this information needed to get out there. So I have a special thing that I want to offer all the listeners. So first of all, the book that I have out, it's on my website. It's a digital download book. It has a live drill in there. The book is called Pitching Velocity, What to Do and How to Do It. And the skill that you'll learn in there is pelvis and trunk rotation. The table of contents, I have to tell you, when I look at it, I am happy with the work that I did because it's thorough. It not only teaches about how this produces the velocity, but it has a drill that I call pitching on your back, and it's a live drill built into the PDF where you see a pitcher on his back like this, but he's actually in a pitching position, and you actually can see all the segments going into full rotation. It's something you can teach your guys how to do. I also have a section in there on how to troubleshoot problems like stride problems, like this problem, that problem. There's guidelines for how to develop your own exercises and drills. And for science people, anybody out there who has a science background, there's a complete section on the kinesiology of rotation, which is a lot of words that unless you understand kinesiology, you won't understand. But I wanted to also make this a good tool for anybody who's a physical therapist or an athletic trainer or somebody with a background. So the book is fantastic, and it's $47, but for my listeners, there's going to be a special sale that I want to give to everyone. So Joe, make sure you write this down too. So the coupon code, if you go to my website, go ahead and buy the book. And when you get to the part where you're going to go to PayPal, before you do that, in the coupon code area, you put in the word rotation, and it has to be all capital letters, all uppercase, rotation. And if you go and do that as of today, when this podcast is published, it'll be $27. And so there's my little gift to all of you for listening, and also hopefully to inspire you to pay attention to this piece, which if this piece isn't happening, the reason why it's not happening is causing other things to happen. And if it's not happening correctly, it's diminishing the pitcher's performance. It's all about the way the pitcher converts his stride into rotation to face his target to throw. If that middle piece isn't done right, the rest isn't going to be as good as it could be. So what do you think, Joe?
Wow, I think that's really amazing. I think a very nice gift for the listeners. It's not even Christmas.
I know. Well, I have to say thank you somehow. And when I started deciding to talk about this next troubleshooting velocity issue, I said, you know what? I want people to have this book. It's a great little book. And of course, whenever you buy any of my products, if you have any questions or anything, you can always call me. So, anyway, so that's it for the teaching moment. And I hope everyone learned something.
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot. That's great stuff, Angel.